Something significant is happening in Quebec's aluminum industry, and it could have consequences far beyond the banks of the Saguenay River. A $1.5 billion aluminum expansion is now entering service at Rio Tinto's Arvida complex, bringing a new generation of low-carbon smelting technology online at a moment when Canada's aluminum industry is facing one of the most difficult trade environments in decades. And there is an important detail behind the headline. This is not simply another factory expansion. It is happening while the United States is imposing heavy tariffs on aluminum, while Canada is trying to protect its industrial base, and while manufacturers on both sides of the border are being forced to rethink where they source critical materials. So the obvious question is this: could America's tariff strategy actually be encouraging Canada to become more independent, more technologically advanced, and more aggressive in finding markets outside the United States? The answer is complicated, but the developments in Quebec are making that question much harder to ignore. Rio Tinto announced on May 29th that it had started commissioning its $1.5 billion AP60 smelter expansion at the Arvida complex in Quebec. The project includes 96 new smelting pots. Once the entire expansion is operating, it is expected to add approximately 160,000 metric tons of primary aluminum production every year. That would bring production using the AP60 technology at the facility to approximately 220,000 tons annually. But again, this is not a case of the entire facility suddenly switching on overnight. Commissioning began in March, and Rio Tinto expects the startup process to be completed by the end of 2026. That distinction matters because the project is still moving through the final stages of bringing all 96 pots into operation. Nevertheless, the direction is clear. Canada is adding major aluminum production capacity at exactly the moment when the North American aluminum market is being reshaped by tariffs and geopolitical pressure. And the location is important. The Arvida complex is in Quebec's Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region, one of the most important aluminum-producing areas in Canada. Rio Tinto says the region accounts for nearly half of its global aluminum production. That makes Quebec far more than a provincial supplier. It is a strategic part of Rio Tinto's global aluminum business. And now that strategic position is being reinforced with new technology. The AP60 technology is designed to improve aluminum production efficiency while lowering emissions. Combined with the hydroelectric power used by Rio Tinto's Canadian operations, the company says the AP60 technology can produce aluminum with greenhouse gas emissions per ton that are only about 1/6 of the industry average. That is a potentially powerful advantage, because aluminum is an energy-intensive metal. Producing it requires enormous amounts of electricity, and in a world increasingly focused on carbon emissions, the source of that electricity matters. Quebec has an advantage that many regions simply cannot replicate: large-scale hydroelectric power. That means Canada can produce aluminum using electricity with a relatively low carbon footprint, while also maintaining a large established industrial base. And that is becoming increasingly valuable. Automakers want lower carbon materials. Aerospace manufacturers want secure supplies. Packaging companies are looking for sustainable aluminum. Energy companies need aluminum for infrastructure. And manufacturers increasingly have to consider the carbon footprint of their supply chains. So Quebec's aluminum industry is not simply competing on price. It is increasingly competing on energy, emissions, reliability, and supply security. And this is where the American tariff story enters the picture. For years, the United States has been one of Canada's most important markets for aluminum. The two countries developed an extremely integrated metals supply chain. Canadian aluminum moves south. American manufacturers transform it into components and finished products. Those products then move through the North American economy. It is a system built on geography and efficiency. But tariffs have disrupted that assumption. The United States increased its tariffs on Canadian aluminum, and changes to Section 232 tariffs in 2026 further expanded pressure on Canadian companies and businesses using aluminum and other metals. The Canadian government has responded with its own industrial support programs. In May 2026, Ottawa announced $1.5 billion in new measures aimed at industries affected by tariffs. That package included a $1 billion Business Development Bank of Canada program for industries manufacturing and exporting products containing steel, aluminum, or copper. Another $500 million was added through the Regional Tariff Response Initiative. The purpose is straightforward: help Canadian businesses survive the tariff shock, give companies working capital, protect productive capacity, and give Canadian manufacturers enough breathing room to adapt. That matters because Ottawa is increasingly treating aluminum as a strategic industry, and the AP60 expansion fits perfectly into that strategy. The United States may want Canadian producers to move more production south. Canada is instead investing in technology that makes production at home more competitive. That is the bigger story. This is not simply Canada saying no to American tariffs. It is Canada attempting to build an industrial advantage that makes tariffs less powerful over time. And that is a very different strategy. Think about what happens when a country becomes dependent on one major export market. The buyer gains leverage. If the buyer raises tariffs, the seller has limited options. But if the seller can increase production efficiency, diversify customers, and develop a product that is difficult to replace, the balance changes. That is what Canada is trying to do. Quebec already has the energy advantage. It already has aluminum expertise. It already has infrastructure. It already has skilled workers. Now it is adding new production technology. And at the same time, Canada is trying to diversify where its aluminum goes. That diversification has already become visible. Reuters reported in May that Canadian aluminum producers were shifting more material toward Europe as tariffs made the American market less attractive and European premiums rose. That does not mean Canada can simply replace the United States overnight. The American market remains enormous. It is geographically close. And decades of supply chain integration cannot be rebuilt somewhere else in a matter of months. But the key point is that the direction of trade can change. Even partial diversification matters. If Canadian producers discover reliable customers in Europe and other markets, they gain negotiating power. And if American manufacturers suddenly face tighter aluminum supplies or higher prices, the tariff strategy can create problems for them too. This is the paradox of tariffs. A government can impose a tariff to protect domestic producers. But if domestic manufacturers depend on imported materials, the tariff can increase their costs. That is especially important for aluminum. The metal is not the final product. It goes into automobiles, aircraft, packaging, construction, electrical systems, machinery, defense equipment, consumer products. So when aluminum becomes more expensive, the effects can travel through the entire economy. A tariff intended to protect one industry can therefore increase costs for another, and Canada knows this. That is why Ottawa has been supporting not only primary aluminum production, but also aluminum processors. In May, the federal government said that 27 organizations connected to Quebec's aluminum sector had received more than 20 million Canadian dollars in support under the Regional Tariff Response Initiative. Those programs are aimed at improving productivity, strengthening competitiveness, and helping companies diversify markets. That tells us something about the Canadian strategy. The goal is not merely to produce more raw aluminum. The goal is to build a stronger aluminum ecosystem: mining, smelting, processing, manufacturing, recycling, technology, and export markets. That is where the real strategic value lies. Because a country that only exports raw material captures less value than a country that can turn that material into advanced products. And Quebec is trying to move up that chain. The federal government is also putting money into the next stage of aluminum technology. On May 29th, the same day Rio Tinto announced the AP60 commissioning milestone, Industry Minister Melanie Joly announced a 100 million Canadian dollars federal investment in the ELYSIS technology deployment project. ELYSIS is the partnership between Rio Tinto and Alcoa focused on developing aluminum electrolysis technology designed to eliminate direct greenhouse gas emissions from the smelting process. The project supported by the Canadian government involves a 440 million Canadian dollar demonstration plant. That is significant because it shows that Canada is not only trying to protect the aluminum industry it already has, it is trying to position itself for the next generation of aluminum production. And that could become extremely important as governments around the world start putting more emphasis on low carbon supply chains. Imagine an automaker trying to reduce the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle. It needs batteries, it needs steel, it needs aluminum. If the aluminum comes from a high emissions production process, that carbon footprint becomes part of the vehicle's supply chain. But if the aluminum comes from a hydropowered smelter using increasingly low carbon technology, the manufacturer has a different story to tell. That is why low carbon aluminum could command a premium. And it is why Quebec's hydroelectric advantage could become a major industrial asset. The AP60 project therefore represents more than an additional 160,000 tons of production. It represents an attempt to combine cheap and relatively low-carbon electricity with advanced smelting technology. And that combination is difficult to reproduce. This is also where the United States faces a structural problem. Building a new aluminum smelter is not like opening a warehouse. It requires enormous electricity supplies. It requires specialized infrastructure. It requires years of planning. It requires large capital investment. And it requires access to reliable power for decades. Quebec already has that system. Canada already has the industrial workforce. And Rio Tinto already has the infrastructure. The AP60 expansion is therefore adding capacity to an ecosystem that already exists. That gives Canada an advantage that cannot easily be erased by tariffs. But we should also be careful about the word backfire. It would be too simplistic to say that American tariffs have already failed. The tariffs are imposing real costs. Canadian aluminum producers face higher barriers to their largest nearby market. Some manufacturers are losing competitiveness. And companies throughout Quebec are being forced to spend money and management attention dealing with trade uncertainty. Canada is not immune. The government itself has acknowledged that tariffs are causing tangible damage across supply chains. That is why Ottawa has committed billions of dollars in support. So the more accurate argument is not that U.S. tariffs have destroyed themselves. It is that tariffs may be accelerating a Canadian response that could eventually reduce American leverage. That distinction is important because industrial policy takes time. The AP60 project did not appear because of one tariff announcement. It has been years in development. The technology represents a long-term investment, but the trade dispute changes the strategic value of that investment. Before tariffs, the main question might have been, can Rio Tinto produce aluminum more efficiently and with lower emissions? Now another question has been added. Can Canada use that production to become less vulnerable to trade pressure? And that is a much bigger geopolitical question. The answer will depend partly on markets. Europe is becoming increasingly interested in lower carbon industrial materials. European manufacturers are facing their own pressure to reduce emissions. Canada has a trade agreement with the European Union. And Canadian aluminum already has a reputation for being relatively low carbon compared with many competing sources. That creates an opportunity. Instead of competing only on volume, Canada can compete on the characteristics that matter to advanced manufacturers: low carbon, stable electricity, reliable political institutions, proximity to North America, and growing diversification into Europe. That is a powerful combination. But there is another factor: China. China dominates global aluminum production. That makes Western aluminum supply chains strategically sensitive. The United States does not want to become dependent on China for critical industrial materials. Canada does not want that either. And Europe is also looking for secure sources of metals. That means Canadian aluminum can potentially become part of a broader Western supply chain strategy. Canada does not need to become the world's largest aluminum producer. It needs to become a reliable producer of strategically important low-carbon aluminum that may actually be more valuable. And the AP60 expansion strengthens that position. Once all 96 new pots are operating, the expansion is expected to add approximately 160,000 tons of annual primary aluminum capacity. That is a substantial increase. And because the project is located within an established complex, the new capacity can be integrated into existing infrastructure and supply chains. Rio Tinto also says the AP60 expansion, together with a planned aluminum recycling center at Arvida, will more than offset the production lost from the closure of older Arvida pot rooms. So this is not simply about increasing capacity. It is also about replacing older production with newer technology. That matters for productivity, it matters for emissions, and it matters for the long-term competitiveness of the Quebec operation. Now consider the political message. The Canadian government is effectively saying that the response to tariffs is not retreat, it is investment, not abandoning aluminum, but modernizing it, not simply looking for temporary relief, but building stronger domestic supply chains, and not depending on one customer, but finding more markets. That is why the timing is so interesting. Washington is using tariffs to encourage companies to manufacture more in the United States. Ottawa is using subsidies and investment programs to encourage companies to maintain and modernize production in Canada. The two countries are pursuing industrial strategies at the same time, and they are competing for the same factories, workers, capital, and supply chains. The old North American free trade model assumed that companies would decide where production made the most economic sense. The new model is different. Governments are increasingly shaping those decisions. Tariffs, tax credits, subsidies, investment requirements, procurement rules. Everything has become part of the competition, and aluminum is one of the clearest examples. The United States is trying to increase domestic production. Canada is trying to make its own production more valuable. Mexico is also trying to protect its position in North American manufacturing, and companies are caught between all three. This creates both risks and opportunities. For Canada, the risk is that tariffs remain high for too long. If American customers move permanently to other suppliers, some Canadian exporters could lose market share. For the United States, the risk is that tariffs increase costs for American manufacturers while encouraging Canada to develop alternative markets. For manufacturers, the risk is that the supply chain becomes more expensive and less predictable. But there is another possibility. North America could end up with more domestic capacity across the board, more Canadian aluminum, more American processing, more Mexican manufacturing, more regional supply chains. That could make North America less dependent on overseas suppliers. But it could also make products more expensive if the new production is not competitive. So the real test will be productivity. Can Canada produce aluminum efficiently enough to compete globally? Can American manufacturers absorb higher material costs without losing competitiveness? Can governments support strategic industries without creating permanent inefficiencies? Those are the questions that will determine who actually wins. And Quebec's AP60 project gives Canada a strong starting point. The technology is modern, the electricity is relatively low carbon, the industrial ecosystem already exists, and the project is being commissioned at a time when global demand for secure and lower carbon materials is increasing. That does not guarantee success, but it creates an opportunity. And there is one more piece of this story that deserves attention: jobs. Rio Tinto says the AP60 expansion will directly support around 100 permanent, high-quality jobs locally, while also helping consolidate positions throughout the supply chain. That may sound small compared with the $1.5 billion investment, but the economic effect extends beyond direct employment. There are contractors, maintenance workers, equipment suppliers, engineers, transport companies, technology firms, local businesses, training programs, and the knowledge generated by operating advanced industrial equipment. That is how industrial clusters develop. The value is not only in the number of jobs at the factory gate, it is in the network around the factory, and Quebec has spent decades building that network. So when a company invests $1.5 billion into the region, it reinforces more than a single production line. It reinforces the entire industrial ecosystem. That is why the AP60 expansion matters to Canadian economic policy. And it is why Washington should pay attention. The United States can impose tariffs. But tariffs do not automatically create competing factories. They do not instantly create new electricity supplies. They do not create specialized workers overnight. And they do not erase decades of industrial expertise. Canada already has those assets. The challenge is whether Ottawa can leverage them effectively. If Canada combines hydroelectric power, advanced smelting technology, critical mineral resources, domestic investment incentives, and export diversification, it could turn its aluminum industry into a strategic advantage. That is the possibility. But there is still a long road ahead. The AP60 expansion is only being commissioned now. The full 96-pot startup is expected by the end of 2026. ELYSIS technology is still being demonstrated and developed. Trade negotiations with the United States remain uncertain, and global aluminum prices and demand can change rapidly. So, this is not the moment to declare a Canadian victory. It is the moment to recognize that the industrial map is changing. And the biggest change may be psychological. Canada spent decades assuming that access to the American market was essentially guaranteed. Now, that assumption has been challenged, and the response is forcing Canadian companies and governments to think differently. Where else can we sell? What technologies can make us more competitive? What industries should we protect? Which supply chains are strategically important? And how do we turn Canada's natural resources into higher value products? Those questions are becoming central to Canadian economic policy. And Quebec's aluminum industry is right in the middle of them. So when you see the headline about a $1.5 billion aluminum smelter expansion going live in Quebec, the story is bigger than one Rio Tinto facility. It is a story about industrial resilience. It is a story about energy. It is a story about technology. And it is a story about trade. The United States may have wanted tariffs to make Canadian aluminum less competitive. But Canada is responding by trying to make its aluminum more valuable, more efficient, and more diversified. The AP60 expansion is part of that response. And if the strategy succeeds, the long-term result could be an aluminum industry that is less dependent on any single market and better positioned for the global demand for low-carbon materials. That would not mean America has lost. It would mean the old assumption that Canada would always be economically dependent on the United States has become much less secure. And that is the real significance of what is happening in Quebec. A $1.5 billion investment is moving from construction into production. 96 new smelting pots are being brought online. Production capacity is expected to rise by about 160,000 tons per year. The electricity comes from Quebec's powerful hydro system, and the technology is designed for a lower carbon future. At exactly the moment Washington is using tariffs to reshape North American trade, Canada is building a stronger industrial position at home. Whether that eventually becomes a genuine Canadian advantage will depend on what happens next. Can Quebec attract more investment? Can Canada diversify its exports? Can low-carbon aluminum command a premium? Can Canadian manufacturers capture more value instead of simply exporting raw metal? And most importantly, can Ottawa turn today's trade crisis into tomorrow's industrial competitiveness? Those questions remain unanswered. But one thing is already clear. The aluminum battle between Canada and the United States is no longer simply about tariffs. It is becoming a competition over technology, energy, investment, and supply chain control. And in that competition, Quebec has just moved another step forward. The AP60 expansion is not fully online yet, but the machinery is being commissioned. The investment has been made, the capacity is coming, and Canada's aluminum strategy is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. So perhaps the most important question is not whether U.S. tariffs have already backfired. It is whether they are unintentionally helping accelerate the very Canadian diversification that makes those tariffs less effective over time. If that happens, the real story won't be that Canada beat the United States in an aluminum trade war. The real story will be that a tariff fight pushed Canada to invest, modernize, and diversify faster than it otherwise might have. And the first major evidence of that transformation is now taking shape in Quebec.